Good morning. We are in Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 8. This is lesson 5A. We're doing the very first chapter out of that homework assignment, as we have been doing. And this week we have one announcement, and that is next week is spring break. And so we will not have class next week. You have 2 weeks to do next week's lesson, which ought to be fun, right? I always love it when I get 2 weeks because then I can really kill y'all when we come back. Because if you give me too much time, I'm in trouble. I can go too far. And honestly, is that not true with every lesson? Honestly, every single paragraph could be expounded much, much more greatly. But I still only get 1 hour and a half to do my lesson, so I don't guess I can expand a whole lot, right? I have to kind of limit myself. But okay, so we're at Mark 8. Tell me what your impressions were of this particular chapter, and how do you see things moving in the progression of events that you've seen unfolding so far. It's quite unique, isn't it, Mark, compared to the other Gospels, where they're so detailed and there's so much more of the plot, sort of, where this one is like just jabs of information about we did this, then Jesus did this, and this is what happened, and then boom, they're on to the next piece of information.
But twice in the same chapter, those apostles, their logistics are terrible.
You are right. They need a programs planner in their group somewhere. Somebody that says, "Let's plan for the next meal. Who's got the bread?"
Man, I need that one. I don't miss a meal.
Oh well, you're so thin. You definitely need a meal. Tiny little thing. Okay. Any other thoughts? There was a pivotal moment, was there not? Did everybody pick up on that? That all of a sudden there was a transition? That we have a major segment division that happens in this particular chapter? And you may not fully see it until we get into next week's lesson, because then you're going to see how strong the switch is on what Jesus' message is. The messages up to this point have been all about what? Kind of on the whole, if you had to categorize what's been presented by Mark thus far, what has he been presenting to us? Who Jesus is. This is the Christ, this is the Son of God, this is the Son of Man, this is the prophet. That prophet one tripped us up a bit because we had 2 chapters of the prophet, and in neither one of them was it totally clear until after, much struggling with trying to figure it all out. But it did finally rise like cream to the surface eventually. You did pick up on it, right? Everybody got it? And did anybody have any trouble going back then after we discuss? I know sometimes that's one of the values of having our precept class together is we come together and we discuss it, and once we discuss it and something is pointed out, like, oh, this first one is he is the prophet, the one who is not accepted in his own hometown. And then the next chapter is he's the prophet who does all things well. And once it's pointed out to you, you go, oh, of course that's what was going on there. But sometimes it takes a group, the brain power has to all kind of come together in one spot, and we all have to hash it out, and then it begins to rise to the surface. It also has a lot to do with learning to evaluate. Now that is something we talked about a little bit last week, where I was explaining to you that the inductive process is not about just reading a question and answering it. And it's not just about either exercising the steps, mark your key words, do your word studies. You do all that for the purpose of what? What is your goal once you've done all the logistical things? There you go, to come to an interpretation that's accurate. Because if you get bogged down in one paragraph and it's about one subject matter, you could really, like last chapter about the woman and the dog statement, and you get so wrapped up around that. One of the things, I actually went back, did you all get my chart in the mail from last week's work? One of the things that I did was I did go back. Let me see if I can find my chart here, because I kind of cleaned up even better, I think, on my chart before I sent it out. what was going on with that woman with the dog statement between herself and Jesus. Let me see here. Am I in the right spot? Mark 4b. 4b. And now we're in 5a, so this should be it. Tell me which paragraph I'm looking for of the woman. Gentile ears. Because. Say it again.
I think it's 24 to 30.
Okay, here it is, yes. Okay. I want to go back just very briefly and just rehash that a little bit to make sure we clarify, because I do think that it's very easy when you're reading something like that for us because we have so much information in our head as Christians, we can have presuppositions. You understand what that means? That you kind of already think you know what you think you know, but it turns out you really didn't know, it wasn't right at all. Okay. And so when we looked at that, and we were looking at this comparison between him saying, is it proper for me to throw to the dogs, meaning the little puppies under the table, the bread, the children's bread, but then there were when I should be feeding the children at the table. And we looked at that initially, probably, I know I did. This is a contrast between Jew and Gentile, and you're to feed the Jew first and then also to the Greek. But guess what? That wasn't what it was all at all. Is that a true statement? Yes. But is that what this context is trying to make to us? No. Why? Because everything that led up to this encounter that Jesus was having with this woman was him trying to get away and have time in a secluded place with his disciples to train them. Did you all catch that? So I went back through on the chart, if you have it in front of you. It says in that passage, Jesus sought seclusion. He entered a house and he wanted no one to know of it. Now, this has been happening repeatedly, and I took you back to see in chapter 6, verse 32, 35, 45, 53, and also in chapter 7, verses 1 and then 24 and 33. So over and over and over, it alludes to the fact that he's trying to get away and have time alone. Why? Because he wants to feed who? The disciples. So now can you see who those children were at the table? He had again, at this point, entered into a secluded house, and he was about to sit with his disciples, and he didn't want anyone to know where he was. So now it's not about Jew and Gentile, it's about Jesus feeding his disciples who are at the table with them. And so his conversation with her was, is it right for me to take my time away from my disciples whom I need to train up? Because guess what? When I go, they need to be equipped and prepared. They are going to usher in a new era of a new covenant and establish a church. Now, they don't have all those pieces of information yet, but that's what he's trying to train them to do, is to understand what exactly is about to happen. And this woman shows up, knock, knock, knock. I have a daughter. She has a demon. Please come. And he's like, is it right for me to throw the children's bread to the puppy under the table? That was what isn't that cool? Once you realize that's what was going on there, you go, oh, that's not Jew and Gentile. Although they are a Jew and a Gentile. That was the other thing that threw us off a little bit, right? But he was simply saying, I'm here in this secluded place and I don't want anyone to know I'm here because I need to train my disciples. So up to this point, Jesus has over and over, he's been doing miracles, signs, wonders to prove who he is. On the one hand, he wants them to grasp that and catch hold of that and to know who it is that gave them their miracle. But he keeps saying, don't tell anyone, right? But go home and don't tell anyone, which didn't work so well, which is what caused the problem. So people keep coming anyway. But now we're approaching chapter 8, and we see again something else going on, right? Up to this point, though, concerning his disciples, what have we seen with them? His own disciples, what? They are wishy-washy. One minute they seem to be on board, the next minute they're not. Actually, what blows me away about this is they actually went out themselves with the message of God as prophets themselves, performing signs and wonders, came back, thrilled. Of course, you have to do your observations in the other text to get the bigger picture of all that. But they had been raising the dead and healing the sick and casting out demons and doing all these things. And then they came back and boom, they're right back to, I'm not too sure if he can provide bread, you know. And then Jesus' response to them when the masses in that first account of feeding the 5,000, he said what to them? You feed them. Why would he say that?
Because they had just gone out.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing how much better and how much clearer these understandings are for us now? And we go back and we read these now and go, of course that's what he was saying. But, you know, when you don't study it inductively, you are never going to get to those kinds of revelations. So this is the richness of doing inductive Bible study, that and these are the treasures that just delight your heart. They are going to, all your life, motivate you to want to come back and get more. I always think of that scripture verse that says, taste and see that the Lord is good. That's not just an invitation into salvation. It's an invitation to a daily walk and into feeding at his table every single day. And I think this method really helps us to do that. So with that backdrop and all those things that we've seen thus far, now we've approached a new chapter here, chapter 8, but we're beginning to see something make a transition. The first thing that happens, however, let's talk about the basics here on what you did on your homework. I need to know your key words. Let me find my sheet. Tell me what you found for key words. Okay, there you go. The eating and the bread and all that again, yes. And that gives you your first paragraph information. It's about the feeding of the, how many? 4,000, okay. And then what? A sign. This one was interesting, huh? Especially on the heels of what? I mean, literally, he just did what? A sign, and now they come to him and they say, we not only that, it was more like we demand a sign, right? And it's not just any old sign, a sign from heaven. Yeah, which is really interesting. And I hope somebody did some work on that. I'd like to hear what you might have come up with. Okay, what else do we have?
Eyes, blind, see.
Yes. Okay, so there's another unique account that's, how unique is it? The healing of the blind man and the way that it transpired. Does anybody notice that?
It wasn't complete. He had to do it twice.
He did it twice. Did he have to do it twice, or he did do it twice? Yeah, I just had to make that point because that was a good way of saying it. No, he didn't have to do it twice. He did do it twice. So there's a deliberate purpose behind that. And this is, again, inductively, once you've done all your work and you've dug into all the details, all your keywords, all the geography, hopefully you did some map work again this week, right? But once you've done all that, now you step back and analyze. It's an analytical evaluation of all that you've read or studied and all the small, minute pieces, which is the inductive part. Then you come back to the whole and say, so what's going on? And in that picture of Jesus healing that man in such a unique way, we'll have to cover that a little bit more. So there's the blind man and the healing of him. I noticed one in verse 12. It's not exactly a key repeated word, but I did see something in there that I thought was interesting. The sighing deeply in his spirit. Did you all catch that one of how Jesus' response to the Pharisees and their response to him and what they were demanding of him and his sighing deeply in his spirit? I'd like, maybe you picked up on some things on that. We have hardened hearts again, where he speaks about his disciples. He talks about beware and to watch out for the leaven. So that word leaven became another key word.
He refers to the generation.
Oh, good girl. Yes. And I forgot to write that one down, but I did look it up. Yes, he said, and if you're ashamed of me in this generation, and you're like, well, what does that mean? Right? Right? Yeah, good one. Yeah, okay. So that kind of gives us once you kind of have gone through and identified either key repeated words or words of interest like that, and you mark them, then you do your word studies on them, and you get that done up front. That's piece one. And it kind of lays down enough information for you to then go back to the text and reread it with all that definition behind you to get to expound its expository kind of view of what you just looked at. So that's really helpful. It's one of the reasons you do those key words. And you do look up, and even if they're not key repeated words, if you just look up words of interest like that one. Okay? All right. All right, so now we're ready to dive in. Let's do that. Let's get started with our very first paragraph. We're going to look at verses 1 to 9. And I know I switched mine in a different spot. I think they went through 10 maybe or something. But I felt like, and immediately began a new spot. So I stopped it at 9. You see, this is where you have flexibility. If you don't like where they stop and start, you can do your own thing. It's okay. As long as there's logic to what you're doing. You don't want it to... Starting and stopping generally is the switch of paragraphs is indicated by a change of conversation. They go from one presentation of an account to another account. Well, the first account in verses 1 to 9 is about whom? And about what? Feeding those 4,000, right? And the two kinds of people groups that keep repeating throughout that whole paragraph are who? The crowd and the disciples. Those are the two major subject peoples in that particular paragraph. Okay. One of the things that was interesting, though, is how many of you, when you looked at this feeding of the 4,000, that you assumed that it was a repeat story from previous? Where we saw the feeding of the 5,000 and now we see the feeding of the 4,000. Did they seem similar? Very similar in a lot of ways. But were there enough distinctions that you were able to say, oh yes, this is two accounts? Absolutely. If you stop and look at it, it becomes so easy. And I don't know, did you guys find that a lot of the things that you listen to through the week, do you guys all listen to videos through the week on these accounts? So did you notice that a lot of these pastors are going, there's a big debate about, is this the same story? I know it. I'm like, slow down, make you...
Only a couple chapters ago when did he forget that he wrote about 5,000? He's like, oh yeah, I forgot. We got to write about this. Like,
No, exactly.
I could see if it was in two different, if you're comparing two different gospels, you're like, are they the same?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Carol. You get the star for the day, girl, because all you had to do was keep reading and find out. In verse 18 and 19 and 20, Jesus brings it up. Don't you remember when I fed this group and then I fed this group? And he lists both groups. He states that they are two independent feedings and on two different events and two different kinds of details are given, which is pretty funny actually also because how the disciples are focused on these details about baskets that they collect. And Jesus is going, okay, you missed the point. Yeah, it's so funny. Okay. All right, so let's talk then about Mark 8. Tell me the pieces to this little flow here. We'll start with Jesus. That's our title. Jesus feeds 4,000. I mean, that's pretty generic right there. Now, where are they?
They're still in Decapolis.
Yeah, they're in the region of Decapolis. Was that 7:3 that we got that from, or 7:30? It seems like, no, 31. I see what I did. I've got to fix that, okay?
Verse 4 makes it clear it's a desolate place.
In a desolate place, which actually explains then why the necessity for a miracle feeding, because in a desolate place, therefore, says there is no food available. It's not like you can run to 7-Eleven. There isn't one, right? Not that you'd want to spend that much money.
They packed for their trip, but they've been there 3 days.
Right. They probably had some food in the beginning, but it was gone by the time we get to this part of the storyline. They've been with him. And that was another distinguishing difference between the two, right? In Bethsaida, in the previous one, they were there for how long? 1 day. And here they were there 3 days. So there's another distinguishing difference. And here they're in the region of Decapolis, which is where? Geographically, on your map, did you do your map work? Okay, where are you? On the other side of the Jordan River, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the Decapolis goes I colored mine in green. It's all this area down in here. And on the map that she gave us, it actually has Decapolis written in there. So what does that tell you? What's on the other side of the Jordan over in here? And it's dominated by what kind of population? Jews. And when you get over here to the Decapolis, what's it dominated by? The Gentiles. So that's a huge distinguishing difference. Did anybody say, well, that's interesting? Does it also give you a possibility of why Jesus may have had 2 feedings? One to the Jews, one to the Gentiles. And who came first? The Jew first and then to the Gentile. So there's a Jew and Gentile application that fits very well. And it also, why might Jesus have done that? I mean, the initial feeding of the 5,000 was a miracle sign, and it certainly portrayed him as the Christ and the Son of God and all these titles that we've looked at. And in doing a miracle, the purpose for miracles is to do what for the prophet? He has authority. Mm-hmm. From above, exactly. That it's God sanctioned, that it is God who is with him. John 2, when he's speaking to Nicodemus, that's the statement Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, makes to him. He says, you could not do these signs lest God be with you. So signs were given specifically as a validation that who you are and what you are speaking is from God. Okay, so that's really important. But he had already done that back in the previous feeding of the 4,000. So, 5,000. So now why the 4,000? Thank you. So now why the 4,000? It's a different people group. So is there a point to him doing that? What do you think he's teaching his disciples? There you go. It is. It's absolutely opening their eyes, because what is the mindset of the Jewish, in particular, even all his disciples who were very Jewish? What is their mindset toward Gentiles on the whole? They're not the chosen people. And any other thoughts? Yeah, they looked down on. They were the unclean, right? And without a covenant and without a people, and they weren't part of the group, right? Did you catch any glimpse of this kind of disdain or looking down within the text itself when you were reading what was being said? Did you notice in verse 4? Somebody read verse 4 real quick. These people. Okay, back when Jesus, and Jesus has said about them in verse 2, I feel compassion for the people. Go back to 6:34. In the first feeding of the 5,000 in 34, it says, and Jesus went ashore and he saw a large crowd and he felt compassion for them because they were what? Sheep without a shepherd. What a distinction between the view of the people, right? Those people, these people, and it wasn't even the people, it was these people. I don't know how it was said exactly, but I picked up on that and I went, that's interesting. And when I went back to make the comparison, I saw Jesus referred to them in the first account as the sheep without a shepherd. That is a very common phrase and term that was equated to the Israel nation as them being God's people, his sheep. Okay, so we have a desolate place. So one of the points that we want to say is these are these are Gentiles. I'll double underline that for geographical purposes and also ethnic purposes. So they're in a desolate place, and he's talking about them as being these people. Now, Jesus didn't do that. The disciples did. These people, and then Jesus earlier had, they were sheep without a shepherd. Okay, so there's an interesting contrast there. That's in verse 4 here, and this one was back in 6:34? Is that what I said?
Hunger, Jesus asked the disciples, he told them to feed the 5,000, the children of God. But here, he didn't ask them at all.
Now say that again?
Well, because he said, if they go away hungry, they'll faint. He just made a statement of fact.
Yes.
That they're hungry. He didn't ask the disciples to feed them.
Right.
But to the Jews, he did ask them.
Right.
To feed them.
That is interesting.
Probably because of the frame of mind of the disciples.
Could be.
Still, that,
Could be.
why would I want to do that?
Right. Well, and also in that chapter, remember, the focus of that chapter was the prophet, and that he had endowed them to be his prophets, right? With signs and wonders, and was sending them out with the message. And when they came back, they weren't exercising it any longer. They had basically reverted back to their old position before Jesus, and they just kind of sat back and went, well, now what do we do? And Jesus is like, I gave you empowerment, which, by the way, you are going to use after my death, burial, and resurrection. They are going to continue to walk this earth during the early years of establishing the church. All the years that they are alive and establishing the church, they are doing signs and wonders. And we read of this all through the book of Acts and in other places. So in that particular case, he wanted them to remember that they had the power. Here, it's like a different subject matter, so the focus is off that. It could be that too. I'm not positive, but yeah, I mean, interesting though. Okay. I think it's very cool to see that in both cases, Jesus felt compassion for the people. I heard a pastor wrongly say, this is the only place he has compassion just for these Gentiles. I'm going, no, he said exactly the same thing in chapter 6 when he fed the others, that he had compassion for them. So if you can go back and look at that's in verse 34 also. He had compassion.
Wasn't there another place? Was it the woman that he felt compassion for, or was it the demon possessed?
Yeah, I know. I don't. Again, it's interesting. I think that sometimes, and anybody can do it, including me. So I'm not, free of messing up on things like little details like that, which are benign. But when you get wrapped up into a story and you're doing so much work on it, sometimes you get wrapped around it and only it, and you forget to, look broader. If that's an important point to be made, then you need to take the time to try to find the other verses and see whether or not it's true or not. But this pastor just said, oh, this is the only place it said. And I'm like, no. Jesus had compassion on the people.
This would be two different people groups, too.
Yes.
He had compassion.
And I do think that's an important thing, right? So he had compassion for the Jews, and he had compassion now for the Gentiles. So what does that tell us about Jesus and his relationship to all people? It's for the whole world. Has salvation always been intended for the whole world? Absolutely.
Well, you assume he was teaching them for 3 days.
Yeah.
So he is teaching Gentiles as well as feeding them.
Yes. And what is the imagery in that? What is the equivalent to that? When you feed people spiritually, what is the picture of bread throughout all of Scripture? It's the bread of life, right? And to eat my words, and even when we did Revelation, do you remember when he gave him the scroll? He said, "Eat this." Yeah. So you see this over and over. The bread of life is that which you consume, and it's the imagery and the picture in everything Jesus is doing. And this is where, even in here, the disciples get messed up. They keep thinking about bread. I'm like, oh, come on, guys. First of all, yeah, you forgot the bread. That's bad enough, right, Cynthia? But on the other hand, I'm not talking about bread. I'm talking about spiritual bread, a spiritual feeding, about spiritual things. Are your hearts so hard? They just were not connecting. Is that possible for all of us to do sometimes? We get so wrapped around our everyday life and just logistically living life that we miss the spiritual things that are going on around us and the importance of what God is either trying to teach. It's like, what do they got? Right over the head and out in one ear and out the other. And that's what we definitely see has been going on here. Okay, so they had those 7 loaves and a few small fish. I don't really want to get too much into the analogy, but I do know that there's a lot of symbolism out there that can be looked at. Did anybody do any work on that? Want to share anything they found on that?
With the numbers?
Yeah, the 7 loaves and then how many baskets they picked up and all that. I just don't think it's super important, so I'm not going to dive into any of that right now. Okay, so then if you compare then with the feeding of the 5,000, it was in Galilee. They were sheep without a shepherd, but he also felt compassion for them, and there were 5 loaves and 2 fish in that first one. Now we got 7 loaves and a few fish. Okay, Jesus reminds them of both feedings then, and I think that is kind of, and I just kind of made a star on this one because it's outside of this paragraph, but I think it says it all, Jesus compared the 2 feedings. Or maybe I shouldn't say compared. He made note of. Jesus he restates, let's do it that way. He restates the 2 feedings to his disciples. And that's in 8, 19 and 20. So if there's any doubt at all by anybody who's watching, even through video and whatever, just move forward in chapter 8 and look at those 2 verses, which you probably already did if you're doing your homework. And you found that Jesus already has addressed the fact that there were 2 feedings. And if Jesus says it, you can guarantee he's not mistaken, okay? Interesting to me is simply to note also, because you want to look at flow of thought. Note the flow of thought. Okay, and what I mean by that is what happens next connects to what happened previously, right? So we're going to go to 10 and look at 10 to 13 now, where we have these Pharisees coming on board. So what's going on in the next part? And how does it relate, if there is a relationship, to anything that's been going on here? What kind of things are you seeing in here? Well, first of all, location. Where? Dalmutha? Where is that? Back in Jewish territory, right? In the region of Galilee. It says it borders with Magadan. Does anybody know what Magadan is familiar with?
Well, one reading commentary I read was that it was maybe the place where Mary.
Yes, because Mary of Magdalene. Yes. Kind of cool. Okay. So we have a guess where Magadan was, but the other one we're not as sure of. But they do know that there are all other historical ancient writings by historical writers like Josephus and so forth that mention it. So we know it was there. We just are not exactly certain of the pinpoint, but they know it's in that region. They know it's closely associated with Magadan. Okay? What's going on? Give me the storyline.
Pharisees are wanting a sign from heaven.
Yeah, they are, and not just wanting. Like, well, show us. We really want to see Because we want to be sure that if we're going to follow you, that we want to be sure we're honoring God. And no, that, like, just the opposite is going on here, right?
Well, they're totally oblivious to what all these miracles.
I know I know. So that was going to be kind of my question to you. When you look at what's going on, it says that they are demanding a sign. Okay, so it says that they are, first of all, the Pharisees argue. So that's their first clue. Argue with Jesus. Seeking a sign from him.
Sign from heaven.
Yep, from heaven. Which kind of implies what to us? Well, I mean, is there a difference between just a sign or a sign from heaven?
Well, they're questioning his divinity.
Yes. Oh,
Well, you had the argument of your Beelzebub also.
Right.
To this. So, okay, you're saying you're not from the demon, then show us one from heaven. Prove it.
very, very. And I do think that attitude is exactly, it was like a prove it to me. It was not out of a heart of interest or a heart of sincerity or. It was, there you go. It was to test him. So it goes on, they asked
I looked up the word argue.
to test Jesus. Okay, good. Give me that. Well, let's put those on here.
4802.
Give me the number again.
4802.
Okay.
And it's to seek or examine. In the New Testament, it is to discuss, dispute, or question.
Dispute and question. I'm going to put to question with contention. Exactly. So that's the word argue. Sorry. Okay. And then the next one is the word test. And tell me what you found there.
3985. Examine, learn the true nature, try to trap.
Yeah, isn't that weird? To try to trap. You know, you can have a test, like God tested Abraham, for instance, right, to test his faith. But in this case, the whole connotation to it is so different. To make a trial of, like literally to put you on trial in a kind of in a way that we see trials going on in our nation today. It isn't to prove whether you're innocent or guilty. It's to prove that you are guilty, right? You're already guilty before you even got to the trial. Huh?
It's abusive.
It is total abusive, and it's total preconceived, premeditated decision. They've already made their mind up. You're guilty. You're wrong. You did this horrible thing. So it also, by the way, this to test him it's a Hebrew idiom. I did not know that until I looked it up. It says literally means as an idiom to take an attempt, to attempt to do something with the implication of not succeeding. So they're testing him so that he will fall on his face. Yeah, very interesting. They have already heard eyewitnesses, right? What else? Do we get in when these Pharisees keep coming from Jerusalem and the various places and the synagogues that they're coming in from? What is their intention when they approach Jesus? What is their demeanor and their? They're very antagonistic. They're seeking a way to destroy him. And at some point, this is going to turn seriously deadly, right? Because the seeking to destroy isn't just to get him out of their way, but literally to destroy him. So their intent then is actually to reject any sign that he will do. So it won't matter. I've heard somebody say recently, wouldn't matter what I say to you or how many good things, I know, you're not going to believe, right? You've already made up your mind. You already do not like me. You already have rejected me, and you refuse anything that I would give you, no matter what sign. Sorry. It just came into the head. See, this is the problem with an extrovert. It comes in the head and comes right out the mouth. I have to rein myself in. Okay, so it's totally a hardened heart. They have a presupposition position that they're standing in. So the expectation is that Jesus will not succeed, certainly not succeed to convince them, right? There is no sincerity in their motives in the test. And in a way, they're hypocrites because they're coming to him as if they're going to give him a chance to show them something. But hypocritically, again, they have already made their mind up. They're not going to believe it. Now, take that kind of mindset and think about how there are people in your life that you've tried to witness to and maybe are still trying to witness to, that's kind of the way it is. They have already, now, can they ever be budged off that? Oh, yeah, they can. I look at Nicodemus in the end. Nicodemus is the one who went and pulled Jesus' body and put it into his own tomb. This was a man who was very skeptical up front, but you could see him slowly warming up to the idea. And then after all the events occurred, then he made that final step forward and said, this is. Although we don't know, I mean, there's no definitive thing that says to us he did, but by his actions we see that he had made a decision for Christ. So, or at least in my opinion, I see it that way. That, I mean, I can't imagine anybody would go and take a dead body, what do you call that, making himself unclean, right, on that holy day, and putting his body into a tomb of his own, if he did not believe he was who he had said he was. And that was before the resurrection. That was at his death, putting him into the tomb. That's amazing. Okay, so they tried to test him, and it's without sincerity. Without intent to be convinced. Their intent was to reject any sign he did. Did anybody go into Matthew and look at the other account? Because how do we see him respond to them at the end? It says he sighed deeply in his spirit. So what is that talking about? Did anybody look that up?
Groan deeply and
Yes, to groan deeply. It was literally, it says from the bottom of the heart, a groaning. Any other thoughts on it? Any other insights on that word, groaning and this deep sighing? What was going on within Jesus? Sure do. We absolutely have this deep sorrow. Now, on Jesus' part, for a man that's not his biological child, obviously, he's created being, but why is Jesus so deeply groaning in this moment?
Because they're not going to get it, and they're not going to be saved.
There you go. The end result for them is what Jesus is seeing. He's seeing their eternal demise. He's deeply groaning because it says that the spirit was stirred to its depths. The sigh was physical. It was a physical response. But its source is spiritual. A sense of irreconcilable enmity, invincible unbelief, and coming doom. So, I mean, that was out of my worst word study. Wow. I was like, wow. Now, we did not go there. I don't think we did it in our homework. Did you go look in Matthew 12 where the same account was given in Matthew 12? In that one, he doesn't just say no. He says, he's sighing. He says in verse 12, truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. So he says, I'm not going to give you any sign. But somebody go to Matthew 12:39.
He answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation craved for a sign, and yet no sign shall be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet.
Oh, but the sign of Jonah the prophet is mentioned in the other one. It's interesting that Mark doesn't want you to get distracted with that part, so he doesn't put that in here. But he actually does go on and say more than what Mark has recorded, and that is there will be a sign, but it's not the kind of sign you're wanting, and I'm not going to give it to you right now. It's going to be a sign that's going to come later. When he says the sign of Jonah, does anybody know what that's talking about? 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, so shall the Son of Man be. As it was with Jonah, so shall be the Son of Man. And what he's saying then in response is they're wanting a sign from heaven. This is something beyond just feeding, just a healing of somebody. I mean, as if it's not enough to make a blind man see, right? Or the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. But he literally says to him, no sign is going to be given to you but the sign of Jonah. And and he doesn't say it, and you're going to have to wait for that. And when it happens, I hope you'll remember this occasion. But he is not going to waste his time with them right then. Why? Does he not care about them? No. The deep sighing tells you he cared deeply. And previously in the other passage before where it talked about he had great compassion for all the people, Jesus' compassion is for all humanity. So as you're reading through the storyline of Jesus and his life and his ministry, everything about who Jesus is all about him trying to draw you into relationship with him, that you might have this eternal relationship, that your soul not be condemned to hell, that you not be separated from him. And yet people love to just drop into these things and say, see there, he's not even going to answer them. Right? But that is not the intent that was being made there. And when you look at the other one, he says, a sign will come, not today, but another day. Okay? So since Mark leaves it in the way that he does, I'm not going to give you a sign, and he went on the other way. Why not? What had Jesus already done? He just fed all the people, and he just healed people, and he just did all kinds of miracles up to this point. How many times do you think these Pharisees have had eyewitness accounts given to them by people who had either themselves been healed or that they had witnessed it?
Where other Pharisees went and saw him in the temple, healed a man's hand. So
Yes.
word should have spread from there too.
Right. So we know that they had. So Jesus had already done all they needed to be convinced that he was the Christ. Their refusal to see and to believe was willful rejection of what was right before their eyes. Now, I said it in that way because we're going to come up to a place where we're going to start talking about not seeing and not understanding in the next paragraph. And isn't that interesting, this flow, how the flow of thought keeps going on here? So they demand a sign from heaven, as how we, Pharisees, whoops, let me get my other color. And I use the word demand to make it more clear that it was a negative attitude on their parts. The Pharisees demand a sign. And you could go on and say a sign from heaven if you prefer to do all that. Okay? Any other questions? No? Okay, let's move to the next paragraph. It's going to be 14 to 21. So we have Pharisees who refuse to see, and then we just have these plain, dense, dull disciples who are following him everywhere, seeing it all, experiencing it for themselves, and yet what's going on? It just blows my mind. So we see, and they had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have any more. than one loaf in the boat with them. So their mind is all on something temporal. Again, it kind of makes me think, when we were talking about the Pharisees in one of the earlier chapters, we were talking about how Jesus kept saying it's not the external things that will defile you, it's the internal. It's not about the external. Well, that idea of external, internal, spiritual versus the flesh, what are the disciples all concerned about again? The flesh. And what has Jesus just done? Created bread for thousands out of a couple of loaves, or 7 loaves and a couple of fish or so. And yet they're still concerned about getting fed. And why? It doesn't explain. I read through a lot of commentaries on this, trying to figure out what made them keep going to the bread thing. But for whatever reason, they got distracted. Would you say that? When you did your evaluation, Kay asked you to kind of evaluate what do you think was going on with these people. What were some of your points that you put down on your sheet? Let's see if I can find my page there. Because it was interesting to just evaluate what, after you know everything else that's leading up to this and what's been going on. So, yeah, that's so true. You're right about that, Carol. Men are always hungry. Not all men, but most men. I know my husband is. So page 55, she said in question number 6, observe Mark 8:14-21. What did the disciples not understand? Had they really understood Jesus' words in verse 15? So 15, he was giving orders to them saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Okay, he's talking about leaven, and their mind went again to bread, because bread has leaven in it. Actually, this sounds like some of my conversations with my friend Celeste. She and I get talking in circles, and I never know. Sometimes she and I are talking on 2 different things, and then we go, oh, that's what you were talking about. Yeah. Okay, so what we see then is they are distracted. They're not really listening. Have you had a conversation with your husband or your children where you're speaking? I see all those eyes rolling. I saw that. And they're not really listening. And so you're like speaking into the wind, and then later, like an hour later, honey, I told you. No, you didn't tell me that. Yes, I did. You were sitting right there, and I said, honey. Right, anyway. So that's kind of what was going on here. So in a way, what does this kind of show us about the disciples?
They're very human.
They're very human. They're very human. And you also have to take into consideration all their experience with God and relationship with God. It's easy for us to just kind of, I don't know which way, just criticize them because of their density. You guys are really, really dense. But you have to then pull back from that and say, wait a minute. What has their experience with God been? What were they really thinking was going on here? And what were they expecting when, quote, the Christ were to come, right?
I was just going to say, it doesn't tell us what they were all thinking about. Were they still thinking about what just happened over there? Were they thinking about, I saved that blind man when I went over here? Like, what's their head doing?
Right.
Even if he's talking, you might be like, oh, you said that, now I'm thinking.
I do that in services when my pastor's preaching. My head's going here, and then all of a sudden I go, no, what did he just say? Right? Poor pastor, I'm so sorry.
Their minds were all over the place.
Yes.
There's just seeing stuff and experiencing stuff.
Oh, and it had to be like a big spectacular show almost every day for them in a lot of ways because
They
of.
still might have been waiting for, when do the swords come out? When do the swords come out?
There you go. Because, again, this is why I'm saying to you about what we're doing inductively here. The presuppositions that we bring to the plate often get in our way. They block our ability to hear and see and understand. And so if you don't do what we are doing, and that is step back, evaluate the flow of thought, what's come before, what is their historical setting for them as men. They're fishermen, and one was a physician, and one was a tax collector. I mean, these were just the common men, and their idea of who God is from the Old Testament system, right? And although they know they have a Christ coming, they've waited so long that at this point in history, have you ever been overdue on a pregnancy? You're like, it's never going to happen. And then all of a sudden it does, you're like, oh, you're caught by surprise. It is easy for us to criticize them, and yet we can't see that. So when Kay asked you to take a look at this, what did we see was going on in their minds? Temporal things, distraction, and they certainly were being spiritually blind because they were not going to the spiritual. They were looking all on the physical and the temporal. Okay? All right. What?
I saw that as being, like Kristen was saying, their minds had to have been spinning because they just picked up 7 baskets of remaining bread. And they didn't take it.
I know. And by the way, it wasn't baskets. The first one was baskets, like a small lunch basket. They collected 12 when they collected after the 5,000. With the 4,000, what did they collect? 7 large. They considered them hampers. And the cross-reference took you into the book of Acts, where Paul, when he had to escape, because he was going to be, he hid in a basket. That's the kind of basket that's big enough for a man to crawl down inside and sit. That's how big those baskets were. So that's a distinction between the two different events. Is one were little baskets where they just collected the 12 small baskets, but this one were these big hampers. And yeah, they forgot to bring any bread. What's wrong with that? Right, okay, one basket, one hamper would have been plenty to get them through, right? Yeah.
He says that obviously there weren't women with him.
Yeah, that's it. Or the women were told, shush. I don't know, yeah. Well, and also remember, they were traveling by groups. Often there were women in there. But almost all of these accounts where they're caught short-sighted like this is when Jesus is alone with just the 12. And so they had gotten into a boat again, and they're out in the boat, and they're going, we have 1 loaf of bread. Right, we each get 1 bite. All right, so 14 to 21, how did we title this? What is the main conversation that's going on here that Jesus is trying to show us about his disciples? What's
Their teaching is very effective.
Say it again.
Their teaching is very effective. Were we talking about the Pharisees?
14 to 21, how is Jesus, what is Jesus saying to us over and over in here about his own disciples at this point? They're not understanding, they're not seeing, they're not remembering, they're not, he actually quotes, you having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? And then he brings up the first feeding. And he lays that out before them, and they're going, oh yeah, we picked up this many baskets. It's like, okay, that's what you got out of the feeding of the 5,000? And the 4,000 is that you picked up baskets full because why? They forgot to bring food. And he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? So in 14:21, it's his disciples. Do not yet see. What kind of seeing? Spiritual seeing. So this is about they are distracted by the physical, and Jesus keeps pointing to the spiritual. That's the contrast that's going on throughout that. And they keep going back and forth on this. The disciples, they are completely distracted. They forgot the bread. And that was in verse 15. And then Jesus, he wants to make a warning. Jesus gives a warning. And what is the warning? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees.
Don't you think that him saying that could be pointing back
to verses 11 through 13, where the Pharisees had just asked for a sign.
Say it again.
That particular verse could point back to verses 11 through 13, where the Pharisees were asking for the sign.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. And because the whole point is when he speaks about the leaven of the Pharisees, what is he? Let's define it. What does this mean, the leaven of the Pharisees? Let's define that word. Did anybody look that word up?
Yes.
Okay, let's get that one down here.
Commonly associated with sin, false teaching, or hypocrisy.
Okay, and leaven is number 2219. Okay, and it was used in a metaphorical way. Okay, and give me your definition again.
Well, it's metaphorically used to represent influence, often of a corrupting nature, commonly associated with sin, false teaching, or hypocrisy.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. Okay, so represents corruption. Corruption.
False teaching,
It could be of many things. False teaching.
hypocrisy, illustrating how a small amount of leaven can permeate and affect a larger whole.
Hypocrisy and unbelief, I'm going to put on there. Right? So metaphorically, leaven, on the whole, leaven is a picture of sin, just so you know that. Leaven on the whole. In almost all the other accounts, when you go and look at it, it's about sin. So it's about moral corruption.
It can get in and ruin the whole body of
Yes.
Christ.
Yes, so viewed in its tendency to infect others also. So it doesn't just affect the one that it gets into, but it's like measles, it spreads. Only requiring a small amount to completely pervade a thing. So because yeast, the idea of yeast, which is another word for the leaven, right? Yeast pervades. Yeah, like mold, yeah. But I bake bread all the time, so I got this idea of the yeast, how it causes the whole loaf to rise. It's just a beautiful picture, and it's a really good analogy in here. And
The thought came to me that, on the contrast of that faith can grow if you just have
a little mustard seed will grow. Yes, I love that. But it's a very distinct difference between yeast that spreads and something that's planted, right? I love that picture.
The leaven was used in that analogy as well, along with the mustard seed.
Mhm.
That was a positive use.
And later in the temple worship, one of the things that we saw, well, it's not later actually, it was earlier, was when God instituted one of their feasts, which was unleavened bread, because the picture was of sin and how sin has been cleansed because of the work of Christ on the cross. So they had the unleavened bread, the days of unleavened bread. One of the things that's very interesting is it's the leaven of unbelief, a refusal to see. I'm going to put this on. I think I'm going to switch to this other color because my black isn't working very good. And this one's almost black. Okay, it's the leaven of unbelief, a refusal to see. Isn't that interesting? Because here we want to see a sign. They demand to see a sign, right? You got the eyes there. They want to see a sign. Here, he's saying the leaven of them is, I won't give them this sign, which he's just said to them. Why? Because they've already made their mind up. They won't believe anything they see. They've got a preconceived answer already ahead of time. Their motives are not pure. Their motives are not to be shown or to have any kind of change of heart on things. they had already refused to believe. So he says, I'm not going to show you something when I know you're not going to follow it and you're not going to listen to it. And so now the disciples, he's saying, you need to be careful of this kind of hypocrisy and of this kind of unbelief. And so he talks about the leaven of unbelief because it's a refusal to see. Again, you got the eyes, right? I guess I should give it an eyebrow to make it look better. Okay, and then Jesus' response then here to his disciples, how did you view it? What's the tenor of what's being said here? It is a frustration on Jesus' part. And yet he's really persistent. He never has given up on these disciples. He called them specifically himself. And by the way, do you remember how he called his disciples? He spent hours in prayer the night before. He had been to the Father in prayer and prayed about who shall I call. Of course, they know this already, who they're calling, that they're people who have been prepared before even the foundation of the world. God's got that kind of knowledge. But Jesus tells us he spends time in prayer choosing. So it's a deliberate act on who he chose. So he's not giving up on them. And yet he's frustrated at this point with them. Why are you not yet seeing? And in doing that, he's really holding their feet to the fire. He's saying, look, you've been shown who I am, and you are still refusing. I'm talking to you about spiritual things in all the things that I'm doing here before your very eyes, and you're talking about bread. Let me tell you, this is the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians. It is unbelief, a refusal to see the spiritual. And he's calling them on that. So Jesus calls them out. In a way, it's a rebuke. And he calls them, again, to see, not to be like the Pharisees. Okay? He wants them to see. In verse 17, do you understand? Okay, interesting, because now for us this is really interesting because the language is so precise. So understand, what does he want them, what does that mean, to understand?
Realize to the point of insight.
Yeah, to realize to the point of insight. I love that. Do you understand? Okay, this is going to be number 4920. 4920, and it means to realize to the point of insight. Now, I like the use of that word insight. Again, there's that word sight. Isn't that interesting how that just keeps coming up over and over on this? They're unleavened of unbelief, and he wants them to understand to the point of insight. What else does he ask them? What does he talk to them about? About their hearts? Do you have a hardened heart? Now, that's also, I think, a real direct approach. When you're working with people that you're trying to bring them into faith and you're discussing things with them, sometimes you have to quit spoon feeding and just say, you tell me. Do you understand? Do you have a hard heart? I used to call them devil's advocates. I had people would come to me with these, can God make a rock too heavy to pick up, Stupid questions, things that were like no-win answers and ridiculous. And it was all because, again, they had already, in their hearts, they didn't really want an answer. They just wanted to argue. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, wake up, pay attention. Do you not understand? You're seeing these things, pay attention. And come to see, come to have insight, come to have understanding. And it's not the kind of understanding you're seeing with your eyes, it's the understanding of the eyes of the heart. And that's what he's calling. And by the way, is your heart hardened? Have you become so complacent in your all of us, have we become so complacent in our attendance at church, in our activities that are spiritually related, that we're doing it by rote and out of an obligation of some kind, rather than out of a real heart for God? Is your heart hardened? Can that happen to even a believer? Absolutely. Because I really believe these men in particular are men who have been called, and they did have a heart to want to believe. And they were following him and leaving everything behind. That tells you a lot. And yet their hearts were so hardened, they weren't seeing. I mean, he brings up these other two feedings and says, do you not see? And at the end he says, he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? It's like, no, this is not, you're not even penetrating you. The hardened heart, again, it's a metaphor to make the heart dull, to grow hard, callous, become dull, lose the power of understanding. But I like this definition up front, even before the metaphorical part. It's to cover with a thick skin, to harden by covering with a callus. Yeah, that was interesting. Did anybody look that one up besides me?
45 minutes.
Okay, we're good. We're almost done. 44:56. This one's an easy one today. To cover with a thick skin, to harden with a callus. Okay. So I just think that both of those questions that Jesus probes them with really gets their attention, apparently. I do believe it was like fertilizing the soil a little bit, tilling the soil a little bit, giving a little bit of water to the plant. The seed's already been scattered by Jesus himself on the hearts of his disciples. And he's just trying to take them then and preparing them for this next thing. Now we come to this next event, which you can see now the progression, right? It's all about eyes not seeing. You need to have eyes to see, right? And now what does he do? He heals a blind man who didn't see and now is going to see. But he does it in a unique way. This one is very different from all the others that have ever happened. So we're in 22 to 26. And this one, I'm just going to title it Jesus Heals. Did I title? Yes, I did. Okay. And that barely really tells you anything. He does heal a blind man, but is that the story? Well, not really, right? So what kind of a miracle is this? How would you describe it in your own words? Stages. Heals in stages. What else?
Both of the stages are different. One is spitting and one is just like hands.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So he makes a little difference in what he does. Do you think that really makes a whole lot of? I looked really hard to see what might symbolically be the difference. Now, I did hear one pastor say that the two things that Jesus did in here were things that were pretty common in that day for them to do for people who were blind or whatever, to put spittle on the eyes and that kind of stuff. But we know that it does not matter. This was a miracle, what Jesus was doing. But would you say this was deliberate? Okay, so he heals in stages and increments. It was deliberate in execution. And by the way, it's the only one recorded like this. That is what I was told. I did not have time to go and read every one, but the experts on the different pastors that I listened to and the different commentaries that I read said this is the only recorded miracle by Jesus where it was done in increments, by stages, which I thought was very interesting.
It doesn't say anything about the blind when he did the first part of the healing, the blind man saw a little bit, because then it says, the blind man looked intently
Mm-hmm.
to Jesus, and maybe his faith
Yes.
came about there.
Absolutely.
And then he did the full
So there's
restoration.
probably a couple of things going on here. There is a primary reason why Jesus is doing what he's doing, and then there's a secondary benefit. The secondary benefit, I think, is to the man who is actually healed. It feels like it's supposed to be the primary, but I really think it's the secondary. Because why do I say that? What follows 22 to 26? What happens in 27 to 30? The confession that he is the Christ. Whose eyes have been opened? Peter, the disciples, Peter, and all of, and actually in the use of it, it's a royal you. It's not you, Peter, it's you, all of you. So he's speaking to all of the disciples that are there. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So that's where we miss out when we don't have a full command of the language, of how they phrase things. But Jesus is speaking about Peter. Peter makes the declaration, but it's a declaration that is unanimous of them all, which I think is really cool. So what we're seeing then in the flow of thought here is he has this blind man who comes to him. Is it a coincidence? It follows on the heels of Jesus saying, don't fall to the hypocrisy and to the leaven of the Pharisees. And what is the leaven? We've decided it's their blindness, it's their unbelief, it's their refusing to see, refusing to understand. And then Jesus rebukes the disciples for, seems like they're trying to fall into that, or they have somewhat fallen into that. They are not seeing, they are not believing, they're not understanding. He brings up the two feedings, and they go right back to the physical. They miss the spiritual. So he's rebuked them on that, which is really cool in this, when you see this sequentially happening, because they've just been rebuked. I can say that in my life, I know that when I've had a rebuke in my life of some kind, I have them very rarely, but when I've had, just kidding, but when I've had a rebuke in my life through a circumstance or through a person, the very next time that event similar comes up, I'm usually paying closer attention. I'm like, oh, I do not want to ever do that again, so I'm not going to go there, right? So would you not say that that's probably the tenure that these disciples, their hearts have been set right? They've kind of been, pay attention. Are you not learning? Are you not understanding? Are you not seeing? And so then he takes a blind man and he heals a blind man, and he doesn't do it in the way he's ever done it before. Do you think that Jesus, when he healed the blind man, he had to do it twice because he just didn't quite make it the first time? So what we know is you never violate your known doctrines about Jesus. Jesus could have not even looked at the man and he could have been healed, right? Like the woman with the daughter and the demon, just go home, she's fine. And he did, and she did, and she was. So in all the others, remember, a woman just touches the hem of the garment and she's healed. Nothing is said to her. She's not touched. There's no spit involved. There's no physical contact. Jesus was even unaware, except that he was aware. It says that his power had left him because of her faith and her touching the hem. So here we have a situation where Jesus takes a man aside. He does a partial healing. Why? Because he couldn't do it right the first time? No. Obviously, your known doctrine is he could have done it any way he wanted to, and it would have been instantaneous if that's what he chose. So what we're seeing here then is a deliberate choice to do it in increments. For whose benefit? Well, could be for the man, that his faith, it certainly is true, I would bet, that Jesus, in doing it in increments, really helps draw that faith out of the man himself. That is true. But was that why he was doing it? Well, the flow of thought tells us no. Certainly he helped the man, and that's good for him, right? But in this flow of thought, the author's purpose is he's showing you how Jesus brought them to a realization that their eyes as disciples were finally opened. And why do you think Jesus is showing us all this about his disciples?
They're just like us.
They are just like us. They are everyday men struggling to make sense of what they're seeing and what's going on. And remember, this is a huge transition from an old covenant eventually into a new.
Three things.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but the word that he uses to say that the blind man began to see, that's completely different than just seeing.
Mhm.
It's like he begins to, first of all, he's been blind, right?
Mhm.
He doesn't know what seeing
And he
is.
doesn't even know light. Yes.
And this word, it means to gaze upon something or someone with focused attention. It's like he began to see Jesus. You know? He began to, like the disciples, to understand.
And it was my understanding that the first phase, he was just kind of
Yeah.
dazed and kind of fluttering around. But the second phase of it, he focused, and now everything came clear. And there can be a good picture in that too, huh?
Yeah, but it also, let's see, he began to see everything clearly.
Yeah.
But the other thing that grabbed my attention, so they took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village. And then at the end,
Yeah, he said,
Jesus
"Don't
sent
go
him
back."
home and said, do not enter the village. Now there's something about, that's got to be.
Well, again, this is that Mark mystery thing that's kind of going on that is talked about over and over. Don't go tell, don't go show them, don't, it's like he doesn't want them. But then other times he's like, go tell them, go back to your hometown and stay here and tell them all. But in particular in the Galilean area, where it would be closer to where the Pharisees are and the other spiritual leaders of the temple, he didn't want a lot of fanfare being talked about. He wants to give enough miracles that he validates that it's true. But his main reason, remember back in Mark 1, what is his reason for coming? To preach the gospel. So he wants to preach, and he does as many miracles as he has to in order to validate what he's saying. And his hope is, tell them, don't tell until after the resurrection, then they can say all they want, right? He doesn't want it to get, why not? He doesn't want it out there too soon. Why not? What's going to happen if they all get convinced he is the Christ? No, they're not going to put him on a cross. They're going to protect him from the cross. They're going to exalt him, make him king. And is that what he came for in his first coming? No. That's
Just the flow of thought from what just happened, do you not see? That Jesus used this as an example to the disciples to say, see, you can see, and the man saw
trees, like sticks.
and walking around like trees walking. And that, to me, that's the physical.
Mm-hmm.
But then he laid his hands on him again, and then he was able to look intently.
Yeah.
Which means to focus on it, and that is the spiritual side.
I agree. That's a really good point. And this is the cool thing about every one of these paragraphs. You can go so much deeper into every one of them and really pull so much more out. But would you say, from the flow of thought, we're looking at an account that's sandwiched in between the disciples not yet seeing and understanding, Jesus doing something to help a man see, but doing it by increments. I think it's, in a way, it's to say you're dull. Your hearts are still hardened. You're not seeing because you're not perceiving and you're not even trying. And then because of that rebuke, then when he does this miracle of this man in these increments, they're going, oh, that's just like me. I was slow to see, right? And now my eyes are open. And then the very next paragraph, he trudges forward now with his agenda. And he's like, okay, now the pump has been primed. Everything is set. If they can't get it at this point, we're in big trouble. But of course, Jesus knows they will, right? And so then comes the next stage. So he heals a blind man. It's a deliberate process to teach the disciples about their own spiritual blindness. And one of my commentaries that when I was doing my word study, it brought up that this is just like what happened in Ezekiel. And I laughed when it said Ezekiel. I went, oh, yes, it is. How many times was Ezekiel given a message from God and he was said, lay on this side, now go cut your hair, now go scatter it to the wind, now, all these, cook your food over human dung and all kinds of horrible things. Why? It was a picture. And this is the way Israel was used to receiving their information. It was very common for them. So what Jesus does right here, in a way, it's like a parable acted out for them. It's a parable that was acted out. So you can go, let's see, did I give myself a reference? I just said as seen in Ezekiel. Okay, that's just kind of a conclusion statement about what's going on there. Jesus brings the man out of the village. The man's told to go directly home. Do not enter the village. This miracle was done for Jesus' disciples to see and to believe on him. This was that final, last little straw that's put on the camel's back to get them where he needs them to be. This is for his disciples to see and understand, because that's all he talked about over here. Don't you see? Don't you understand? Right? Okay, so that's that. Now we're going to go to the next part then, because now comes the lovely picture of the confession, 27 to 30. I'm just going to title it Peter's Confession, even though it's all of them, just so you know that. And his confession is what? That Jesus is the Christ. Okay, now, we have to talk about this again one more time. When we studied about the Christ, what do we know about the subject of the Christ?
What do we know, or what do they know from the Old Testament still? Because there's two different things, what we know versus what they know.
Yeah, not what we know, what they knew, because that's their confession is he is the Christ, the Messiah. So the Christ is Christos, Messiah. I don't have the number on here. Do you have it? Say it again. I have it on my homework sheet. I didn't get it onto here for some reason. Okay, he's the Messiah. And go on and finish defining that for me. What else? Oh, here it is. Say it again. Yeah, it means the anointed one. And when you're speaking about being anointed, what is the anointing for? Authority. And ultimately to be what? King, right? An anointing. The anointed one, the king of Israel. That's what they think of when they think of the Christ. He's the king that's to come. He's the descendant of David who's going to restore sovereignty to Israel and usher in a kingdom of glory and honor for their nation. So they're looking at him as the king of Israel who will usher in the kingdom for Israel. That's huge. So knowing that, because if you miss defining that idea, what was his declaration? You are the Christ. You are the Christ. Okay, so interesting. So Mark records then that Jesus then does what after that? Because we're going to move on to the very last. How are we on time? Oh, good. We're going to be done early. I mean, we can add in more. This is interesting, though. I do think I should add a couple of points here since I've got time. So, they finally have confessed. He is the Christ. Right? That's the biggie. That's in verse 29. They finally see. And understand. And then what does Jesus tell them?
Don't tell anybody.
Do not tell anybody. And what verse was that? 30. Thank you. Then he goes on to say, what does Jesus then do next? Let's go on to the next paragraph, because this is so cool the way this wraps up. So we're in 31 to 33.
How did you know who I am? This is what's going to happen.
Yeah. 31 to 33. So when you titled 31 to 33, how did you title it? Did you know, this is where we talked earlier that there's a switch, kind of a change of focus of attention, right? What does he switch over to now? It says he began to do something. What? Began to teach him what? That he is the Christ?
It's not going to just be.
Is that what it says?
The Son of Man.
Oh, he's not the Christ. Oh, wait a minute. I just made a declaration that you are the Christ. And now you're saying, oh, the Son of Man. And then he does a switcher. That's like pulling the rug right out from under their feet, because he now makes a switch of their focus of attention. He finally convinced them he is the Son of God, the Christ, the one who was the only begotten of the Father. The deity, the glory, the kingship, the ruler, the authority, the power, the sovereignty. They've got it. And now he goes, oh, I'm also the Son of Man. Interesting. Oh my goodness. This is just so not fair. So Jesus begins something new. Begins to teach he is the Son of Man. And in that, what were the points that he says about the Son of Man?
He must suffer anything to be rejected.
He must suffer. He must be rejected. What else? He must be killed. And he must rise again. Okay. I see kingship all over that. Do you? No.
Where's the destroyer?
Yeah. This is not the Christ we were talking about 5 seconds ago. We've now made a complete switch. So it's interesting. So what you see that is a storyline of Jesus month by month, week by week. By the way, I think from one of the things that I read, they're about 6 months to the cross at this point. So they've gone through all these 2+ years, and he's pulling them to get them to see he is the Christ and make that declaration, and finally for it to settle in a way that holds. It is not fleeting. He wants it to solidly hold. Although quite honestly, it doesn't completely solidly hold, because what does Peter turn right around and do? Even right here in this paragraph. Let me tell you who you are. Let me rebuke you in the name of Jesus, right? Oh, so funny. So this is in 31. He's not the Christ that they had just proclaimed over here, he is the Son of Man. And in the Son of Man, now what does that Son of Man mean? He is the Son of Man. We did this definition already one time before. Did anybody look it up again by chance, or do you have it handy? It's a compound thing here. You do number 444, which is the word man, and then the number is 5207, which is son. And what is being conveyed here when he uses this title as Son of Man?
He's of the flesh.
Yeah, he's of humanity, right? He's of humanity. He is flesh and blood. He is a man. My definition, does anybody have any more definition handy that they want to share before I? Okay, but it says in my dictionary, it says it's carrying the connotation of mortality. I thought that was real good. Carries the connotation of mortality. That title, Son of Man, carries the connotation of mortality. Somebody read Isaiah 50. No, I guess we could do that one too. 50 verse 6. Then there's another one in 53, 1 to 12. And I would like to read those two passages. I have another one on here too, but we'll skip it. Because concerning the Son of Man, what have been the prophecies about the Son of Man? Now, so he's just done a switcheroo on him. It's like a bait and switch in one of those what do you call those games where you put the shell game? Yeah, you stick a little pebble under there and move it around. They just made a proclamation, he's the Christ, he's the King, he's the one who's going to come and establish the kingdom of God.
We can assume he agreed with it.
Of course he did.
Don't tell anybody.
Right, and don't tell anybody.
they
So,
get the picture,
absolutely.
like, yes, I am the Christ.
Yes, finally you got that part right. Now let's move on. Let's go to the Son of Man. So somebody read 50 verse 6. Isaiah 50 verse 6.
I gave my back to those who strike me, and my cheeks to those who pluck out the beard. I did not cover my face from humiliation and spitting.
Oh, okay. Now 53 1 to 12. It's a longer piece. It's a longer one. Yeah, that's a longer one. Who's got that? Nice and loud. Because our people on the thing can't hear otherwise.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty, that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted in him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and for his generation, who considered that he was cut out of the land of the living? For the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many, and interceded for the transgressors.
Wow.
Just kind of like, remember this one?
Yeah. Excuse me, disciples, do you remember Isaiah saying all these things about God's coming servant? That he would do all these things, everything that we just listed. Where's the list? Oh, here. He must suffer, he must be rejected, he must be killed, and he must rise again. Now, I think the only thing that wasn't in there, except it talks about the salvation of the many, we know that's only acquired by his resurrection. But all this other is in there. And so they believed he was coming as the Christ. They finally accept that fully, and now Jesus says, oh, yes, but I came to be the Son of Man as well. And that's where I'm at now. And this is where, so now this is very interesting. So we see Mark records that Jesus begins to teach him that he's the Son of Man, all these things. It says in there that he was stating the matter plainly. So this was not, he was no longer using parables. He wasn't using symbolism. He wasn't doing what he did over here where he basically uses a parable, right? And he acted out what was going on with them. If you go back into Ezekiel, that's exactly what he says. My people, they're blind, their hearts are hardened, they don't see. And what did Ezekiel do over and over? He gave them these parables that he acted out so that they could see. And so here, though, now Jesus in verse 32, he's doing these things plainly. So it's no longer, it's different from what we've seen so far. That's my point. Jesus is now speaking plainly.
I looked up that word, courage, boldness, frankness.
Yeah. Yeah, that word plainly is, unreserved, frank, without concealment, without figures and comparisons even. So it's just plain, it's right out there. He's like, no, this is how it is. And he says it clearly. Now, Peter took Jesus aside now and rebukes him, which is hysterical. This is born out of what? What caused Peter to feel that Jesus has just said, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be killed. And I guess he missed the part that said, and I'm going to rise again. He turned it out before he got to that part. He goes, what? Suffer? What? Be killed? No, you're the Christ. You've come to set up your kingdom. So why do you think Peter has said this? What could be fear, yes. And misunderstanding, not getting the whole picture. Again, not paying attention to what Jesus is saying. That's been the problem all along here. They're not taking the things that now Jesus speaking plainly. They are not hearing that what he's saying is, I am the Christ, yes, but I came to be the Son of Man. And the Son of Man must, what Isaiah said. Although he doesn't say that, they know those scriptures. They know the Old Testament passages. And that's just one of many. I gave another one on my chart here out of Zechariah that you can go look at. And there's so many of them that have prophecies of the Christ coming and suffering and dying. But now Jesus is speaking plainly. They're still not hearing. Still not hearing. Peter, still not hearing. he rebukes Jesus. And what does Jesus say to him?
Favorite line ever.
Get behind me, Satan.
Use that all the time.
Yes. Now this is very cool though. Very cool though, because back in verse 29, Peter had just said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now it's not in here, but in Matthew, and I've forgotten where. I don't think I can put it on my chart, but back in Matthew, it goes. It's like 16 or so in Matthew. He goes on to say, "You have not come to this by flesh and blood, but how?" Does anybody remember? Who told Peter this? It came from God. It came from my Father who is in heaven, who has revealed this to you. So on the one hand, Peter's over here in this moment. God's speaking to me. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Good job, Peter. My Father who is in heaven has revealed this to you. Now where he's down here 5 seconds later. I rebuke you, Jesus. Don't say those things. You can't die, right? And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." I mean, to me, that is like, okay, that definitely does explain my life. On one hand, I'm so full of energy and so full of belief, and then the very next second, anything can happen, and boom, I'm on my face again, cowering in the corner and saying, no, you can't do that, right? It's like, oh my goodness. And the fact that there's this contrast between God speaking to him and now he's listening to Satan, and Jesus making that point to him, I just think the contrast is very humorous. It's a little bit of a little funny in there. Okay, so he says, "Get behind me." So now we're at the very last part, which is 34. Whoops, I got to switch pages. 34 to 38. So he is telling them here in this paragraph. How did you title this one? What was your title for? What is going on in this very last paragraph, 34 to 38? Yeah, he's talking about a cross, that if they want to follow him, they must be willing to pick up their cross and follow him. This is really, it's almost like it ties it up into a nice little bow right here. So Jesus informs his followers pick up your cross. And follow me. And I didn't put it on here. I should have said, you must pick up your cross. You must pick up your cross and follow me. So his followers are still perceiving the ushering in of the kingdom of God. And so this is what the contrast is. They see him as the Christ, the kingdom of God, the kingdom coming, and he's saying, no, pick up a cross.
And what would they have perceived the cross?
Oh, they knew full well what the cross was. Absolutely.
People were crucified.
Yes, because of the cruelty of the Roman judgment system in that day. They were fully aware when he used that terminology of the cross. And for him, literally, within 6 months of this, apparently, from the timelining of what others have said, this is going to literally happen to Jesus. He is going to have a cross that he must go to.
They always had to carry their own cross
That mean
anyway.
they were supposed to carry their cross.
Yes.
Be prepared to be crucified themselves.
Yes. Be prepared to. And in the case of the disciples, how literal was this? It was very literal. They all ended up dying for the sake of the gospel. I think John is the last one, and he died peaceably, right? But the others all had death.
They did a lot of bad stuff to them.
Oh, they did terrible things. Yeah, they tarred and feathered him and sent him out to Patmos. Yeah, it was not good. So Jesus is teaching them basically a new mindset here. Jesus teaches a new mindset. It kind of makes me think about over here. He says, "You're thinking on the way that the world thinks, right? but he says, I want you to understand, you need to think the way Jesus thinks. You're not thinking the way the Father. How did it say it there? It says, verse 30. Not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's, in verse 33. And then he goes to the very next paragraph and says, your mindset must change. You must come to understand, I'm not here this time to be a king. I am the king, so you are rightly saying that I am the Christ, the king. But I have come to be the Son of Man. And they were not grasping that. So if he had not told them these things, how do you think they would have received his death on the cross? That would have been the end of it. They would have scattered and left and gone to the four winds because they would have gone, what happened? In many ways, it's what happened with Judas. Judas had his mind set on Jesus being the king. And he had selfish motives in it, that he would be the purse carrier and he would get to have, access to the coin purse, right? And if he was the king, he'd have a lot of coins. And that was his motive. But with the rest of these disciples, Jesus is saying, I need you to pay attention. I need you to see. I need you to hear. I need you to understand. Yes, I'm the Christ, but I am the Son of Man. And that is why I have come. And then he speaks plainly. I will suffer. I will die. I will be rejected, but I will rise again. And they weren't hearing it. No, Jesus, get behind me, Satan. Then he goes to the next and says, look, if you're going to follow, and you really, it doesn't say the Son of Man, but you could put it in here. If you're going to follow the Son of Man, me, you must understand that it entails a cross, a bearing of a cross. What about us? Do we have a cross? If you are willing to come into faith of Christianity, see, this is why it's so important for us to give the full gospel message when we are telling people the gospel. You cannot candy coat it. You cannot leave parts of it out, because too many people think that coming to Christ means their whole life is going to get fixed and everything's going to be so great. That God's just going to pour out blessings, life's going to fall right before your feet. It's going to be a bed of roses, but it is not. And Jesus makes it very clear right here to all of us that if you are going to follow him, it is a requirement that you be willing. Now, do we all have really heavy burdened crosses to carry? Not really. Most of us have a fairly pleasant life, and there are some difficulties and heartaches along the way, but we certainly are not going to jail or prison. We're not being crucified in the sense of being put to death. In many countries, that does happen. In America, we're very, very blessed and we're very sheltered. But do we have a hard time sometimes by coming into faith? Do we get rejected by our families? Do we have to give up things? And in the ministry works that you have, is there a lot of sacrifice that some of you have to put a lot of other things in your life on hold because you're serving others, right? And that's your cross to bear. And if that's the one that you have to bear, that's both a delight and a lot of work. But it's a delight. However, Jesus says you need to count the cost. You need to understand that following me as the Son of Man requires that you understand there's a cross to bear. And that when your life doesn't go perfect, understand that's part of the plan. And in that plan, where there may be suffering for you and there may be difficulties, God is refining and purifying your life. And he is preparing you for a glorious eternity. How does he conclude it to them? If you're going to be ashamed of me in this generation, what? Yeah. I'll be also ashamed of you when you come in when I, Jesus, come. I, not me, Jesus. When I, meaning Jesus, when Jesus comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels, he's showing you this perspective. Are you in this world? Is your mindset about this world and the physical things? That's what was going on with the disciples earlier. Bread. And he's going, please come to the spiritual side of life, right? And here he's saying, if you live your life for this world and for this generation, then he said, then you're going to miss out on the glory when I come into my Father's glory. You won't join me in that glory in heaven. So let's talk it through here. Jesus is teaching them a new mindset. God's interest, not man's interest, from verse 33. I must suffer and die in verse 31. He's making reference to that. He says, by losing your life, what are you going to do? You'll gain your life. What kind of life? Eternal life. If you want to gain your soul, now what is that soul? Anybody look that word up? The word soul? Yeah, it's your mind, your will. It's the moral seat of man, basically. By the way, the soul, is it a temporal thing or an eternal thing? It's an eternal thing. Whether you have your eternal life in heaven or in hell is decided by how you respond to Jesus' invitation. And he says, so in other words, that soul that you're going to gain by being willing to give up this life is a soul that goes into eternity. And by definition, it says, it's the word soul is that which will not be dissolved by death. I thought that was a very interesting way of putting it. It doesn't go away. You don't just close your eyes and go to sleep and life is over. You have an eternal life of some kind. So he says in 34 what? There's the positive. You must do what? You must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. What's the absolute surrender? It is stepping by faith, not knowing what God might require of you, but being willing to do that, whatever it is. And also know this, and it's not in our subject matter, but he will always provide for you what you need to do it. Whatever he gives you to do, he will carry you through it. He will walk you through it. He will be with you in it. And it's by design for you. And each of us have something unique that God is requiring of us. There's a contrast in verse 38. What must you not do? You must deny yourself, but you must not what? That's right. Must not be ashamed of me or my words in this adulterous and sinful generation. So let's talk about the generation thing. Did you get some definition on that? No. Oh, okay. Does anybody got definition about that? Okay, we're almost done. I stopped writing so I could talk through. Now, okay, so generation is number 1074. It is to be understood as a temporary era, age, or period. So when it says this generation, it's just saying this temporal life that you're living right now. Wherever you are in history, this generation. It's your generation. And that's in contrast to eternity. Okay, so that's what he's saying here. Don't be ashamed of me and my words in this temporal life that you're living right now, because there's an eternity to come. If you are ashamed of Jesus and his words in this generation, then Jesus will be ashamed of you when he comes in his glory. So what has happened? Starting right here, we have a new segment. Now I want you to think on how you might want to define the first 8.5 chapters as a segment, and then try to think from this point forward, and as you're doing your homework over the next chapter or two, be evaluating what you're seeing there and saying, okay, I went from him doing what here in this first segment, and what is he doing now in this segment, that there's a delineation or a switch in mindset. And he literally says it. He says, and he began to teach them this. Something new is on the horizon. So we're at a new segment division. And that segment division actually begins in verse 31, which is weird. So you go halfway from, so now you're going into a new segment division. You go up to 830 in an old segment. Why it couldn't have started at the beginning of a new paragraph, that would have been nicer, but it didn't. And that happens sometimes. So, nice. I didn't think that one was so hard. I thought it was pretty simple. Oh, our theme. Good idea. Let's title it. So I really think there are 2 points, because it is a segment division. The first segment is the confession, right? What was the confession made? Jesus is the Christ. And Jesus is the Son of Man. And they are distinctive. They are. He is the same, both the Christ and the Son of Man, but those two things have two different roles, completely different roles to do. So Peter's confession is Jesus is the Christ. The second part is Jesus proclaims, I am the Son of Man. I just think that's like a bait and switch. You just finally get to arrival and you go, yay, I did it. And he goes, oh, but I got a whole new story to tell you now. I'm the Son of Man. And so from that point forward, he's going to talk about who he is as the Son of Man. And we'll see how far that goes. I don't know how far that segment division will go, but thank you guys. It was so fun. It was great. No class next week. We'll come together for the following week to pick up with chapter 9.